think it's fair to say that humanity is facing unprecedented challenges. Of course, this virus is dominating the headlines. It is upending everyday life in a way that we have not seen in our lifetime. Of course, people are scared, people are frightened, markets are plummeting. As parents of, thank God, 6 children, we know the schools are closed, the kids are home, and of course, this ripples all over society. You go to the store and can't buy toilet paper or bottled water, and everyone is uncertain, and there are intense rumor mills spinning out all kinds of conspiracy theories and projections, and everyone's worried what's going to be with their job, with their business, with their income, with their health, with their own personal health, the health of people that they love. It's a very uncertain, chaotic, frenzied, and frankly, frightening time. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to examine maybe a Torah angle of this subject. And I think the way I'm going to structure it is that we're going to start from the more conceptual aspects of plagues, of quarantines, of lessons that maybe we could draw from this time and this experience that we are going through together collectively as a species, and kind of move from the conceptual to the practical. And the most basic insight I think that I want to convey is that in Torah, we're trained that when something happens to us, it's a message from God. We talk about this virus as this kind of venom or poison or infiltrator, this agent that's wreaking havoc in the world around us. But we are trained to view this virus as an agent of God, almost as if the Almighty is taking this agent, sending it to the world, taking this virus, sending it to the world, making it influence everyone to try to send a message. And therefore, I think our duty is to try to accept the message, try to absorb the message, try to decipher and decrypt the message, and try to figure out what's the lesson for us, what do we need to take away, what is the message that the Almighty is sending us, and how are we supposed to act now thanks to this new message. My grandfather, of blessed memory, he used to tell us over that the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, he used to have this line that he would say, he would have this axiom that he would share. He would say, the world is like a mirror. Everything that you see, you have to reflect it inwardly and say, okay, what's the message for me? One of the central Talmudic teachings of the Musar movement is a teaching in the Talmud that talks about the juxtaposition of the juxtaposition of 2 Torah sections and 2 Talmud books. And the Talmud asks, why is these 2 seemingly unrelated subjects, why are they juxtaposed both in the Torah, when they're presented in the Torah, and when they are organized in books of Talmud, these 2 subjects are juxtaposed. And they are the subject of Sota. Sota is a suspected adulteress. And the subject of a Nazir is someone who accepts upon themselves a vow, typically for 30 days, to refrain from drinking wine or any grape derivatives, and to refrain from coming to contact with dead people, and to not cut their hair. 2 very different, ostensibly, 2 very different subjects. And the Talmud says that there is a reason for this juxtaposition, namely that haroeh sota b'kul kula. If someone witnesses a sota, a suspected adulteress, in her disgrace, yazir atzmo min hayayin. They should abstain themselves from wine, i.e., they should make themselves into a nazir. Meaning, when you see suffering, when you see spiritual decline around you, that is a message. And the message is to you, I have to take steps, I have to ensure that this doesn't happen to me. My being privy, my witnessing something happening to someone else is a lesson, is a message to me. And I think we could safely say that there's messages for all of us, for all of humanity, with the events that are surrounding us and the events that are dominating the news. Of course, we know the idea of 6 degrees of separation. Invariably, everyone's going to know someone that is afflicted with this terrible disease, with this terrible virus. And of course, the closer it gets to home, the more intense the message is, and the more we need to have this, and the more we need to have this self-reflection to say, okay, what should I take away from what's happening around us? So what I wanted to do, is there a question? Sorry, I heard some noise. There's a question? Okay. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to analyze plagues and quarantines and lockdowns in Torah literature to see what is the message that the Torah presents to us in the event of a plague or a sequestration or a lockdown or a quarantine. And by way of introduction, I want to examine the first, I would say, quarantine. Maybe that's not a great word, but the first sequestering on record, namely what happened in the book of Genesis with Noah in the episode of the flood. So we all know the story. People, humanity starts to devolve, and there's one righteous person, Noah, and his family, his 3 sons, and his wife, and his 3 daughters-in-law. And he spends many decades building this gargantuan boat, the ark, and it starts raining, and there is a deluge, and the world is destroyed, while Noah and his family, they find refuge. They find salvation in the ark around for around a year, and the world around them is destroyed. So I want to examine this story and see what our sages tell us about the world, the society of Noah, and how there is an intimate relationship between the plague, so to speak, the destruction of the world around him, and the attitude, if you will, of Noah and his family in the ark, in the refuge, shall we say, in the quarantine. So we read in Genesis chapter 6, verse 11, Vatishaches haaretz, the earth became corrupt before God. The earth was filled with lawlessness. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for every flesh had corrupted their path upon the earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me. The world is filled with theft because of them. And behold, I'm going to destroy the earth. So this is the setup of the flood story and of the concurrent story, which is Noah being saved in the refuge of the ark. So I want to examine what Rashi says on this story, on these 3 verses. Vatishaches haaretz, the earth became corrupt. Of course, the Torah, or the words of the Torah, are a little bit ambiguous as to what is the nature of this corruption. Just says that it became corrupt. Well, what does that exactly mean? So Rashi tells us that it means 2 things. Number 1, erva. Erva means sexual deviancy. And number 2, avodah zarah, which means idolatry. And Rashi brings scriptural evidence that this word, vatishaches, that the land became corrupt. The word corrupt in this context is reference to those sins of sexual deviancy and sins of avodah zarah, of idolatry. And then the verse concludes, Vatimale haaretz chamas, that the world was filled with chamas, with lawlessness. What does that mean? Says Rashi, gezel, theft. So what our sages are doing, they're identifying the 3 sins that cause the destruction of the generation of the flood. Again, they are sexual sins, idolatry, and theft. And the verse goes on to say, Rashi goes on to explain, that all flesh was corrupted. What does it mean, all flesh? It wasn't only humans, it was also animals. Animals also have flesh, and therefore the corruption was so pervasive that the effects actually rippled out and cascaded outward and affected the animals as well. And finally, God says to Noah, you come and you're going to build the ark because I'm destroying the world around us. And there's the obvious question. Wait a minute, if Noah's righteous and he's not sinful, and the people around him are sinful, and therefore they're going to be destroyed, why does Noah need to build the ark? After all, the people that are sinners, the people that have done these various sins, they're the ones who are going to get punished. Noah's righteous, and therefore he should not be subject to any ensuing plague that results of the sins of the sinners around him. He, after all, is righteous. So the answer to that question we find again in Rashi. Rashi says, whenever you find, this is quoting from the Midrash from the sages, whenever you find sexual deviancy and idolatry, a plague descends upon the world and kills both good people and bad people. It kills both righteous people and wicked people. It kills the tzaddikim and it kills the sinners. It's totally indiscriminate. And therefore, yes, Noah, you're righteous. If the whole world was like you, there wouldn't be a plague at all. But because there is this plague of an indiscriminate nature, therefore, you are liable to die alongside everyone else. And therefore, you have to build the ark as a way of saving yourself. Amazing idea here that we discover here in the very first example that we have recorded of a plague and of a quarantine, if you will, is that Rashi tells us, quoting from our sages, that under certain conditions, the Almighty is going to unleash a plague whose essence, whose nature is that it's indiscriminate. It doesn't differentiate between the righteous, between the wicked, between Noah and Noah's sinful neighbor. They are all equally liable to be swept away by the flood. And therefore, Noah, you are righteous. You have to carve out some other refuge, because if you're around everyone else, you're equally liable to be put down, so to speak, to be swept away by this plague. So it's interesting. We find here a source to the idea of a plague that affects everyone, and again is indiscriminate and does not differentiate between Noah and everyone else. Therefore, Noah has to be sequestered, has to be quarantined in the ark. So again, what we're discovering here, just by way of a diagnosis, the very first plague in the Torah that we have a record of, our sages give us three distinct sins that caused it to be unleashed. Again, they're sexual deviancy, idolatry, and theft. And also we're given the nature of this plague, that it is indiscriminate, it kills all. It would have killed Noah and his family, even though they are on their own righteous, if they were not quarantined in the ark. Now, I think I want to interject with a question before we get on to the next subject, so to speak, the remedial aspect of what Noah and his family did during the quarantine as a way of rectifying the cause of the plague. But I want to interject with an interesting question. There's a teaching here in Rashi that says, I want to pull it up. Let me pull it up over here in the book. Again, this is chapter 3 of Genesis. There's this teaching of indiscriminate punishment. And the obvious question that we have to ask is, wait a minute, shouldn't there be pinpointed, targeted punishment? Why do we find this idea of indiscriminate punishment? After all, isn't God unleashing the punishment? And shouldn't the punishment be targeted at the people that are deserving of it? So it's interesting, there's different texts of Rashi on this particular citation. Again, this is chapter 6, verse 13. 6:13, easy number to remember. Rashi, in the most common text of Rashi, reads, wherever you find sexual deviancy, you find indiscriminate plagues. And even though we are told that there's 3 sins that caused the flood to happen, only one of them was the instigator of the indiscriminate nature of the plague, namely the sexual sins. And the commentaries ask a question, wait a minute. Why specifically are the sexual sins the cause of the indiscriminate plagues? Idolatry? Ain't that the worst sin in the world? Isn't that up there, of course, the first 2 of the 10 commandments? Believe in God and don't do idolatry? How come when you have these 3 sins, we're told specifically about the sexual sins and the adultery and rape and the like? These are the ones that trigger the indiscriminate punishment of a plague that's blind, a plague that attacks everyone equally. That's a question the commentaries ask. So the Maharal, he suggests an answer. He says when someone does idolatry, they are, so to speak, offending God. That's a sin against God. And when God punishes, it's not indiscriminate. It's pinpointed. It's targeted. And therefore, if you have 2 people do idolatry, one lives on 10 of Main Street, and one lives on 12 Main Street. They're neighbors. One does idolatry, the other does not do idolatry. Well, the Almighty is going to pinpoint and target only the sinner and not his neighbor. Whereas the other sins, they're sins of the body, the way he describes it. And therefore, it's outsourced, so to speak. The punishment is outsourced to an angel to go punish the bodies. And therefore, concludes the Maharal, the angel, he just sees warm bodies. And a body is a body's body. Can't tell the difference, so to speak, between the sinners and the righteous. That's what the Maharal suggests. I want to give a different answer. I want to suggest that our reproductive abilities, that's our superpower. Man is created in the image of God. There's some sort of overlap between a human and the Almighty. How can we say that? The Almighty is creator of heaven and earth. What have we created? Maybe we could suggest that what allows us to be compared, to be similar to God, is the fact that we too could create people. God could create people. And we do, because we also have this God-given ability to reproduce. It's our greatest ability to be special and to be almost godlike. And therefore, of course, there's the balance. Wherever we have our most potential, that's the place where the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, targets us the most fiercely. And therefore, the place where we have the greatest ability to become like God is the place where the ability, of course, on the flip side, to descend to the lowest moral strata. The first mitzvah that the Jewish people are given, Abram is told to circumcise. And it's interesting, the very location, the nexus of what makes us special, what makes us like God, we're told, make sure that you consecrate it for God, you use it properly, you take what we have that makes us special and unique and powerful and use that for a mitzvah. What happens when people corrupt what makes them unique? When people take their ability to create the greatest legacy that they could possibly create, to really make a stamp on the world, to really disseminate their individuality. When someone does that, it corrupts that. They're taking what makes them unique and different and individual, and they're causing that to be commoditized almost, if you will. It caused them to be undifferentiated as a human. And therefore, there's a tit for tat. We know whenever the Almighty punishes us, it's always going to be reflective of the sin that caused us to be punished. When someone has a sin of this nature, the plague that's unleashed is going to be reflective of that nature. This is a sin where people are discarding, are not properly valuing the ability that makes them unique. And therefore the plague itself is reflective of that, and it also doesn't recognize people's uniqueness. When someone chooses to disregard the ability that they have to be the most unique thing, to be different than everyone else, to be special, to be like God, when you disregard that, then a plague is unleashed that too is blind and doesn't differentiate between people. So here we have the setup of the story of Noah. We have a selection of sins, 3 different kinds of sins that are unleashing a very unique punishment that's really unparalleled in Jewish philosophy. We of course believe that the Almighty judges everyone in accordance to their behavior. And here we see something unusual, that there's going to be a plague that's indiscriminate, that doesn't differentiate between the righteous and the wicked, and Noah himself is on the chopping block, if not for the fact that he was able to make for himself a way to escape, so to speak, the reaches of the plague and to go into the ark. So we have the cause of the plague, and now we're going to transition to the solution or the remedy. How does Noah and Noah and his family, how do they remedy that? What is their responsibility? What is the work that they need to do? What's necessary for them? What's on their agenda during the ark? It's going to be exactly targeted at counteracting the causes of the plague themselves. And this is just amazing because, again, the time of the ark is not just there as a time of salvation. It's a time of rectification. It's a time for them to recognize what brought humanity to this level, and fix problems, and make sure that they never fall into the same trap. Okay, so what does Noah and his family, what do they do once they get into the ark? So we read something really interesting in Rashi. And Rashi actually mentions this 3 times throughout the dialogue, throughout the narrative of the flood and the ark story. The Almighty tells Noah, go to the ark, you and your sons, your wife, and your daughters-in-law. Rashi points out, if you read that verse very quickly, you won't notice anything unusual. Rashi points out that it separates the husbands from their wives. You and your sons, it doesn't say you and your wife, it says you and your sons, and your wife and your daughters-in-law. So the men and the women are the husband's wife are separated. And again, when they actually go in, they go in separately. And then when they leave, the way it's presented, leave you and your wife and your sons wife. So again, the husbands and wives are reunited. And Rashi explains, quoting from the Talmud, that over the course of this entire period of entering the ark, entering the quarantine, so to speak, and throughout the duration of the flood, there's going to be no intercourse in the ark. And as a result, we can maybe postulate that if there's going to be some sort of deviancy in matters of marital intimacy that caused the flood, they are warned, they're forewarned at a time to make sure that none of that is going to be there, that's going to be present, so to speak, during the ark, during the quarantine itself. That's A. B, what was Noah and his family, what were they busy with for that whole year? So we think, hey, it's a cruise. You get to spend the whole year. You don't even go to work. You're on this big ship, and you have a window to look out and to see what's happening around you. It sounds like a dream. But we discover from the sources that actually this was the busiest year in history, because Noah, of course, had him and his family, but had all the animals with them, and he had to feed the animals at regular intervals. And in fact, Rashi actually tells us, this is chapter 7, verse 23. It says that Noah, but only Noah, he survived in the flood, him and his family. So Rashi jumps already on the question, what does it mean, only Noah? Noah. So Rashi says what it means is that Noah barely survived. This is the quote from Rashi. He survived coughing and spitting blood from the hard work from the toil of feeding the animals that he had with him. And Rashi quotes a second opinion that says that he was once a little bit late in feeding the lion, and the lion took a big swipe at him and caused him to bleed. Now, there's a midrash that says that Abraham met the son of Noah, Shem, the son of Noah, and asked him, with what merit did you survive the period in the ark? And he answered that the merit was the kindness that we did with all the animals in the ark. For the entire year, we didn't have a regular sleep pattern because there are some animals that eat in the beginning of the night, and some in the middle, and some during the day. So the whole time, they are feeding all these animals, rushing like madmen, rushing from animal to animal to make sure that every animal is fed its proper amount in its proper time. And only once, and it mentions the story, that Noah was late for the lion, and he was punished right away. So what do we see? We see 3 sins that the generation was guilty in that caused the flood to happen. And then we see that in the ark, there is this intense focus on fixing those underlying problems. Of course, idolatry. I don't imagine there was much idolatry in the ark, because this miracle, of course, is going to dispel any notions of idolatry. So the experience itself was tremendously faith-building for Noah and his family. And then you have the sexual misdeeds, and then we have, again, a period of protracted abstinence from Noah and his family. And finally, we have the sin of theft, of not having concern of someone else's property, of not worrying about what someone else is going to feel when they lose their stuff. Theft, of course, is a manifestation of selfishness and lack of kindness. And then we have a whole year that all of surviving humanity is doing nothing but kindness for an entire year. Kindness to the degree that they're not even sleeping, that they're suffering tremendously because of how busy they are doing kindness with the charges that they have. And again, this, I think, shows us, at least by way of introduction, it shows us how the Torah views plagues in general and what is the responsibility of people who are subject to a plague and are trying to save themselves. What ought to be their focus during the time when they're on lockdown, when they're being quarantined, so to speak? Their responsibility is to try to identify and isolate the cause of that plague and try to remedy it by ensuring that their behavior is going to be addressing the problem that precipitated that particular plague. I want to move on now to the next example of a quarantine that we have in the Torah, and that is on the night on the doorstep of the Exodus. The Jewish people have spent several hundred years in Egypt. Over the past year, the final year of their stay in Egypt, they had the miraculous 10 plagues. And now it's time for the final plague, the death of the firstborn, and we're going to leave. We're going to abscond from Egypt, and we're going to go to Israel. Several days before that day, of course, that we memorialize and we try to relive every Pesach, the nation is told to go get for themselves a sheep and tie it to their bed, and this sheep they're going to slaughter, and they're going to roast and going to eat it that night. And then they're told, this is chapter 12, verse 22 of Exodus, to take a mixture, dunk it into the blood, and put it all over their doorpost, and then lock the door and not to leave their home till the morning. So again, lockdown, you are subject to a curfew, you can't leave your home, but you do some really unusual things that night, that you cover your doorpost in the blood of the animal that you sacrificed and you're consuming that night. Excuse me. Why must the nation be homebound, be on lockdown, not leave their home for that night. So Rashi quotes from the Talmud the very same idea that we saw by the time of the flood, by the plague of the flood. Me'achar shenitna reshus lemashches lechabel, after it was given permission to the decimator to destroy, he does not differentiate between the righteous and the wicked. Again, we have a contrast. We have the Egyptians, they're the oppressors. They've been tormenting and punishing and subjecting and enslaving the nation for centuries. And we have the poor Jewish people, the nation of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're going to be saved. And something is going to be unleashed this night that's going to be blind to seeing the difference between these and these, between the Egyptians and their Jewish subjects. Again, we see the same idea of, on one hand, a plague, on the other hand, a quarantine, because the nature of the plague is not to differentiate between the Jews and the Egyptians, between the righteous and the wicked. I think it's interesting to look at what the Jewish people did with putting the blood on their doorpost. They're getting ready to escape. They're packed up. They've borrowed in quotation marks, gold and jewels and silver and valuables from their Egyptian neighbors. They're eating the paschal offering. It's got to be roasted. It can't be cooked. This is the night of the Exodus. This is the night that precisely at midnight, all the firstborn are going to die. What do? They put the blood on their doorpost. They take their determination and decision to identify as the Jewish nation, and they publicize it. And one of the themes of that discussion is the fact that this animal was worshipped as a deity in Egypt. And the Jewish people, for their duration of time in Egypt, many of them were indistinguishable from their Egyptian neighbors. They were also idolaters like the Egyptians around them. And now they're told, take the animal that you maybe previously had worshipped, slaughter it. Only after you watch it for 4 days, and you really have to ruminate about what you're going to do, take your deity and kill it. Not only that, take the blood of this killed idol of the Egyptians, and maybe you, and put it on your doorpost so everyone could see it. And moreover, the commentaries point out, you can't cook it. You have to roast it. What's the difference between cooking and roasting? So one of the differences is the fact that when someone in the neighborhood makes a barbecue, when someone's roasting it, everyone could smell it. The Jewish people are told, take the Egyptian god, that maybe was your god at one point, though, to some degree. Kill it after looking at it for 4 days. Take the blood and defiantly put on your doorpost. And then take this sacred animal, this sacred cow, this sacred sheep, and barbecue it so that the whole neighborhood knows exactly what you're doing. How's that for a challenge of what to do during your quarantine? Again, we have a destruction of an idolatrous nation and society, and we have a way to save yourself, to spare yourself, but that demands a certain degree of self-sacrifice. It demands putting yourself out there. It demands that you kill your deities, kill your lowercase g God in a public fashion. Let everyone know about it. Let everyone know you do it. Let them smell it. Publicize the blood. Now, it is interesting that this particular quarantine immediately preceded the redemption. Now, of course, none of us are prophets. In fact, I always like to say I work for a non-profit organization. Every donation touches them. We're not prophets, and we don't know the future. And my grandfather wrote that unless you are a prophet, you cannot point to any event or any trend and say, okay, this is a harbinger of Messiah. You can't do that. We don't do that. We have to make a very clear caveat and disclaimer about that. But I did see that the commentators, this is one of the themes that is well known in Jewish philosophy, the commentators note that whatever happened in Egypt is a template for all future redemptions. So whatever we see when we study the Exodus, it's not just studying history, it's also presenting or teaching us about the template, the blueprint of redemptions going forward. Isn't it interesting that immediately preceding the redemption, there was a universal quarantine for the Jewish people? When I thought of this, I told my wife, I told Chaya, okay, it's time for us to book flights to Israel for Pesach. Because I always tell my children, the very first thing you do when you hear the Mashiach comes, Messiah arrives, the very first thing you do is you got to book flights to Israel for Pesach. Because after all, once the temple's rebuilt, you need to have, you need to go to the pilgrimage, you need to ascend, as it's called, to Jerusalem, to the temple, 3 times a year. And every Jew is mandated to participate in this Pesach celebration. And therefore, your Mashiach arrives before you tweet about it, before you share it on WhatsApp, before you type on Facebook, before you make a phone call, you go right away to the computer and you right away book your flights, make sure you have those flights. That's what I always tell my kids. So I told Chai, I said, well, maybe something's happening. And maybe, airlines now are giving longer grace periods to cancel flights. Maybe what we should do is we should book flights to Israel for Pesach. And I said, you know what, that's a great idea. But then someone says, well, do you really think that if Messiah arrives, we're going to have a hard time finding flights? And then I posited, after all the airlines are shut down. All their capacity is being sidelined. Maybe what's actually happening is all that capacity is being reserved to send all the Jews to Israel for Pesach. I haven't yet booked the flights, but that was just some of the ideas that we have, or that I had, that, when we are told that the redemption is going to be preceded by a quarantine and we're undergoing unprecedented lockdowns, it gives you something to think about. Again, I want to make it clear, don't misrepresent what I'm saying. I don't know when Mashiach is coming, I don't know when Messiah is coming, and I don't know anything. But I just know what I shared with you, that who knows, maybe there is something there that associates quarantines with redemption. But I think it's interesting to look at what the Jews did. They weren't scared about who they are. They weren't scared about what they stand for. They took their former deities, they grilled them, and they publicized what they did. I heard a very interesting idea this past weekend, this past Shabbos, from my colleague, Rabbi Busco. He said an analogy to circus elephants. How do you train a circus elephant? These elephants are gargantuan, they're massive, all muscle. If they get mad, they could kill the whole building. They can knock down the whole building. And you want him, dancing or balancing on one leg. How do you train an elephant to behave in the way that you tell them? So this is what he said. I didn't Google it, but I trust him. He said what they do is like this. When the baby elephant is really young, still strong, but not as strong as they're going to get, they take a chain and they affix it to the elephant's leg, and they put a stake deep into the ground. And therefore, the elephant tries to walk around, tries to reach stuff, and it's tugged back, and it tries harder, and it can't release itself from its chain. And therefore, even though it grows up, it becomes conditioned, becomes acculturated, becomes accustomed that whenever it feels something tugging on its leg, in its head, you can't move it. It's too hard to move. It's been trained. It's been reared. And when you feel that chain on your leg, when you feel a little tug on your leg, that's it. Your strength cannot overcome that obstacle. And even as it gets bigger and stronger, it's just reflex. Gets trained that when you feel a little tug on your leg, you could go no further. And what my colleague was saying is that that is what slavery is. Slavery is when someone cannot fathom themselves being able to overcome or being able to view themselves in a different way, that they could grow and they could change and they could overcome the limitations that they have. And of course, Pesach, the festival of Pesach that we're about to experience, and of course, that we're talking about over here in the context of plagues, Pesach is all about freedom from bondage. We were slaves and we went free. And of course, our sages tell us that this is not just a historical event, it's also a time to try to free ourselves from all the things that are enslaving us, from all the limitations that we create for ourselves. And I think when we look about how, when we witness, when we examine how the Jewish people freed themselves from their bondage, from their servitude, enslavement to the Egyptian deities, I think it's a good lesson for us as well. We are not pigeonholed to be the same person that we always were. Like the Jews in quarantine, they made a decision, and their decision was to change. Their decision was, we can become different, bigger people than our Egyptian neighbors. We can take their deities and slaughter it fearlessly. We can have pride in what we're doing, and we can display it for all to see. I think it's another angle to what is the proper attitude during the quarantine, during a lockdown, and that is not only to try to change yourself, but to kind of clinch it by being changed to the degree that you're even proud to showcase that to the world. You're not scared of what the Egyptians think. Who cares about the Egyptians? We care about the Almighty and what we stand for, and we're even willing to run the risk, so to speak, of taking our reputation and altering it for all to see and saying, okay, I'm proud of what I stand for. Look what I have on my doorpost, and smell what is grilling. General takeaways that, we don't need to have a different persona at home than we do around, out and about. Like, we're taking what we have inside our house and we're putting it outside of our house. We're putting it by our doorpost. We're putting it in a place that's public. And in general, when someone has an addiction, like idolatry was in yore, the way to remedy it is to kill it. You have to do it in a public fashion. You can't just decide or choose to do it. You have to actually do it, and you have to do something that is going to, to be a significant decision that is really going to impact you, so to speak. The Talmud talks about someone who was a addicted card player and have to kind of take their chips and flush them down the toilet, to take their heroin and just break it, and throw it down the drain, Same kind of idea. Okay.
Good morning. Boker Tov. This is Tina Sachs checking in.
Hi, Tina. How are you?
Doing good. Next week I will be showing the picture of myself. Okay. Anyway, just an observation.
Okay.
I tend to, we're all watching the news these days, and in particular, the CBS Evening News has been doing this phenomenal thing, showing acts of kindness throughout the country, to the point where one of their announcers is going to do something during the week at, I think, 2 p.m. about kindness, teaching to children. And so are we not seeing what was the example on the ark starting to take place in our world, or at least in our country?
Absolutely. And I think there's an element of this idea that we're sharing that's going to happen whether we like it or not. Mm-hmm. The Almighty is going to kind of force us to act in ways that we wouldn't have chosen to act, but due to the circumstances, we're all going to be kind of primed and prompted and nudged to act that way. Mm-hmm. So yes, I think that there's definitely that is going to kind of unearth things almost like even without us choosing to do that. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, okay. Yes.
Thank you.
Rabbi, could I make another observation?
Yeah, of course.
I was thinking about this the other day, about the plagues. And
Yes.
each plague destroyed an Egyptian god. And we look at what we're going through now, and how many of our little g gods are being destroyed. We place our trust in the economy, the stock market, it's being destroyed. We place our trust in our faith in our careers, and a lot of careers are being taken away. So I just see parallels between the things that we could make as gods, and some people have made as gods, are being destroyed through this. I don't know if that's a valid connection or not, but it just occurred to me.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that sentiment. That, yeah, for sure. There are things that, again, not our deities, but are refuges. The things that we all rely on. The stock market is it's always goes up, right? Always. That's just what we're told. And the unemployment's at 3%, and it's just the best economy we've ever had, and people are living longer, and it's just everything is so bullish and so positive. And suddenly, well, am I gonna live out the week? Well, will I have a job? Well, what's gonna be with my retirement? All those things, all those safety nets are suddenly evaporating, and it's terrifying. But ultimately, if we have the Almighty as our safety net, we're way better off. So yes, that's a very good point. Thank you for sharing that, Sam. Moving on to the next, I guess, set of episodes in the Torah, talk about plagues and how to avoid them. I want to go to a few weeks ago. We read in Parshas Kisisa. This is chapter 30. And in this parsha, there are mentions of 2 plagues, and one of them is how to avoid plagues, and one of them is an actual plague. So the parsha begins with an instruction that when the Jewish people are counted, when there's a census, it's not done by lining up the Jews and counting them as people. Instead, each one of them makes a donation of a coin, a half a shekel coin, and the coins serve as a proxy for the people. You count them at the coins, and then you know the amount of people. But the verse, quite interestingly, says, when you count the Jewish people according to the numbers, every man shall give an atonement for his soul to God when counting them, i.e., every man should give a donation to the temple coffers as an atonement for their soul while counting them. And there will not be a plague when counting them. And there will not be a plague when counting them. And Rashi says, in the event that the Jewish people are counted by people, not by this proxy method of coins, there will be a plague. And it quotes a story in the times of David, in the book of Samuel, where the people were counted and there was a plague. So it's a really interesting idea here, the commentaries will talk about, that we're told that the methods through which we count people, that matters. And if we count them by people, there's going to be a plague. And if we count them by coins, there's not going to be a plague. Why, if we count by people, is it going to cause a plague to happen? So the commentary suggests that when I make a list of people and I just count them without discriminating at all, in effect what I'm doing is I am equalizing. I am not differentiating between people. Instead, what we do is we take the coins, and the coins are actually used for the daily sacrifices in the Temple of the Tabernacle, and those coins are going to be used instead of the people. I think the idea here is going to follow along this line. As we mentioned, the essence of a plague is when people are not differentiated. The righteous, the wicked, they're equally susceptible to the plague. And therefore, if we do activities that don't differentiate with people, don't treat people as individuals, just as numbers, as statistics, then we are likely to engender a plague. I think it's interesting here. We have these coins. Coins are valuable. And those coins are used to buy the animals for sacrifices in the temple and in the tabernacle. What that means is that we recognize that every individual is valuable and every individual is needed to create a relationship between the Jewish people and God. Sacrifice, of course, for a relationship between us and God. And therefore, it's interesting, we see here the same theme. A plague is when people are not differentiated, and the way to avoid a plague, a solution, if you will, is to see individuals as unique entities, as people of worth, and not only that, people that are necessary to foster a relationship between us and God. In fact, the parsha begins, or the verse begins, Ki si sa, when you shall uplift the people, i.e., to count them, but it's not described as counting, it's described as uplifting. When you uplift every individual and realize their value, then people are unique, people are individual, and the idea of a plague that doesn't recognize the uniqueness of people, that doesn't recognize the individuality of each person, that is going to be avoided. So that's just, again, along these same lines of what the essence of a plague is and how to avoid it. And then I want to go through 3 distinct plagues that struck our nation. In the aftermath of the golden calf in Exodus, of course, the golden calf is about idolatry. After the golden calf happened, there was plague. In the aftermath of the Korach rebellion, Korach was Moshe's first cousin, and he thought that he was worthy to lead the nation and not Moshe. So that's almost like theft. He wanted to steal. He wanted to take away unjustly, unlawfully, the stature of Moshe. And that also resulted in a plague. And then in the aftermath of the Moabite women, this is when Bilam is hired to go curse the Jewish people. Ultimately, the curses fall flat, but he gives the advice to Balak to go conscript Moabite women to go sit with the Jewish people. And the commentaries explain that that wasn't just about sexual misconduct, it was also about idolatry. That also resulted in a plague that caused 24,000 victims, 24,000 dead. So it's interesting. The 3 plagues that struck our nation in the story of the Torah, they are precisely for the same sins that Noah's flood, or the flood of the Noah story, caused. We said it was because of sexual sins, because of idolatry, and because of theft. And what do we have? Aftermath of the golden calf is idolatry. Korach rebellion is about theft. Moabite women, that story, it's about sexual misconduct. Again, the same 3 sins that are triggering these plagues that are indiscriminately attacking the nation. Now, I think it's interesting. If you look at what happened in the Korach rebellion, the Korach mutiny, the Korach insurrection, and how it was resolved. It's a very interesting episode of how it was resolved. The verse says that Korach and his family were swallowed up by this magical sinkhole. And after that happened, the people started complaining. This is chapter 17 of the book of Numbers, and this is verse 6. The entire assembly of Israel began to complain against Moshe and Aaron, telling them, you have killed the people, the nation of God. And what happened afterwards? Verse 9 we read, verse 10 really. God tells Moshe, get away from this nation, from this assembly. I'm going to destroy them in an instant. And a plague is unleashed. And Moshe tells Aaron, grab a fire pan, put incense on it, and quickly offer incense to go save the people. So Aaron starts running, and he runs amid the nation, and the plague has already begun, and people are dying indiscriminately. And he goes precisely at the point where the plague is happening. On one side, you have the people that are dead already. On the other side, you have people that are living. And he starts offering this incense offering, and the plague stops. 14,700 dead, and the plague stops thanks to the Torah, thanks to the offering of the incense. Now Rashi tells us the backstory of this revelation. How did Moshe know that the way to stop the plague was via the incense? And he tells us that the angels, when Moshe came to heaven and Moshe got the Torah, initially the angels were quite hostile to Moshe. But ultimately they kind of liked him. And each angel gave Moshe a gift. What did the angel of death give Moshe? He gave him an insight that plagues are stopped by Ketores. Plagues are stopped by the incense offering. In fact, the sages record a dialogue. Aaron comes to the plague site and he starts offering the incense, and the angel's like, no, what are you doing? You're stopping me. I need to continue, go killing everyone. And Aaron says, well, Moshe sent me over here to go stop the plague. And the angel of death says, well, God sent me to go unleash this plague. And therefore, my sender, so to speak, is greater than your sender. So Aaron responds to the angel of death. Well, Moshe wouldn't tell me to do this unless God told him to send me. And therefore, I'm coming from God as well. And you know what? If we have a question, let's go to God and Moses and have them mediate this dispute. But anyhow, ultimately, the Ketores, the incense offering, stopped the plague. And this is, of course, the secret that the angel of death gave Moshe when he was in heaven. Now, the question I want to pose is, why is the Ketores, why is that the antidote for plagues? I want to suggest an answer. The Ketores is a list of 11 ingredients, actually mentioned in Parshas Kisisa, the original that we read about it. 11 different ingredients that are mixed together and create this incense that are burned on the altar. And the resulting wafting aroma was incredibly beautiful. So much so, the Talmud tells us that no one in Jerusalem would ever need to wear any perfume because the smell, the intense aroma of the Ketores made everything smell beautifully. The sheep, the goats of Jericho were sneezing as a result of the beautiful smell that was happening from Jerusalem. Now, parenthetically, our sages tell us that one of the ingredients of the Ketores, the chalbana, actually had a rancid smell. It smelled terribly. But when it was put together with all the other ingredients, the totality of this cocktail was beautiful. And our sages tell us what that means is that when the Jewish people are praying, when the Jewish people are fasting, well, we cannot disregard, we cannot ignore the sinners. We have to bring the sinners, i.e. the chalbana, i.e. the Jews that don't smell good, so to speak, bring them to join us, and the whole nation has to be united. The idea is, the Ketores reminds us that every single Jew is valuable. Every single Jew is necessary. Every single Jew is salvageable. Even the Jew that smells bad, so to speak, even the chalbana, it's needed for the Ketores. You cannot have a Ketores without a chalbana. Every Jew is part of this team. Everyone is a necessary individual. The plague happens when we don't recognize that people are individuals. We don't recognize the indispensability of every individual. And the Ketores reminds us of the exact opposite, that even the people that smell terrible have a rancid, putrid, disgusting, terrible smell. Even those people, we need them for the Ketores. Even those people are salvageable. Even those people are necessary. If we don't have the chalbana, we don't have the Ketores. When someone has that recognition, everyone's needed, everyone's valuable, that the Almighty does not put someone on this earth unnecessarily, that is the antidote for the plague. I want to kind of transition to the more practical ways of implementing some of these ideas. Practical things to think about and to work on during this lockdown period. We know that the markets got absolutely hammered, and everyone's 401ks dropped. Everyone's retirement are now suddenly in jeopardy. A lot of people lost a lot of money, unless you invested in like Zoom, which apparently went through the roof, or other, maybe the grocery stores did well. But anyhow, the economy is really suffering. And of course, the traders and the investors know that this is actually an opportunity. This is a sale. And everyone's trying to figure out where's the bottom of the market. You can buy tons of stocks and equities and investments, and once the market rebounds, you'll make a lot of money. And I think that's happening in the... Good to see you, David. Thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us. That's happening in the markets, but it's also happening in the spiritual markets. Spiritual greatness is on sale. Spiritual greatness, we're at the bottom. We're at the nadir of the spiritual world. Things are on sale, and there's opportunities for us to achieve greatness on the cheap. I want to tell over some stories that talk about how great people step up in times of epidemics and outbreaks and quarantines and the like. The great Rabbi Israel Salanter, who was one of the greatest Jews of the 19th century, in 1848 in Vilna in Lithuania, there was a cholera epidemic. And the stories about what he did during this epidemic are absolutely legendary. He himself, again, the great rabbi, what does he know about epidemiology, virology, etc.? He built a hospital with 1,500 beds to be able to treat the infected. He rallied the physicians and made them all work pro bono. He took yeshiva students, 60 of them, and created a task force of people who are there helping the sick, subjecting themselves to potential infection, and helping bury the dead. And in fact, amazingly, not a single one of these 60 people that were in danger of their lives got infected with the disease. And in fact, he gave very severe rulings. He said that if there ever is a health dilemma on Shabbos, you need to desecrate the Shabbos, don't say, oh, let me find a non-Jewish doctor. Let me look around, find a Gentile. No, because the second you wait a little, the second you tarry, you may lose a soul. And the Talmud is very clear that to desecrate the Shabbos in a time like this is a mitzvah, and to sit around and wait, maybe we'll find a Gentile to do it, is actually a sin that's going to endanger someone else. Before Yom Kippur that year, he hung up signs around the whole town saying that not only may you eat on Yom Kippur, everyone must eat. And in fact, it's pekuach nefesh, it's moral danger. You have to eat this Yom Kippur during this cholera epidemic. And even if you feel fine, you have to eat. Not only that, he went from shul to shul in Vilna. And he went from shul to shul in Vilna, and he made kiddush. He took grape juice, took wine, and made kiddush on Yom Kippur in these shuls. And the logic behind that is that, if you make a proclamation and you say, let us all eat on Yom Kippur, what are people going to say? I feel fine. I'm not going to desecrate Yom Kippur. Maybe the individuals, let them, let the people that are actually sick, let them desecrate Yom Kippur, let them eat. But me, I feel fine. And that attitude could be potentially dangerous, and people could die. And to overcome this extra piety of the individuals that are going to fast, even when they should not fast, he abrogated the fast for the entire community. It's interesting, after Yom Kippur was over, the court, the Beis Din of Vilna, they brought him into a halachic law, halachic court case, and they said to him, you should have consulted us. You shouldn't have taken matters into your own hand, and therefore we want to punish you. So he threatened them. He said, if you try to punish me, I am going to invalidate every get, every marriage or marital divorce document that was ever done by this court. Because I have a proof to show that there's a certain leniency that you are relying on that's not valid, and I can invalidate every get that you have presented from this court, and therefore they were scared of him, and they said, okay, we're not going to start with you. In addition, the Chazon Ish, that I recently did a series on the Jewish History podcast about, in the 1910s, there was, in the town that he was living in, there was an outbreak, and the burial society, the Chevra Kadisha, they did not want to bury the dead because they were scared of getting infected. Even today, you look at what it's like burying the people who are, God forbid, victims of the coronavirus. These people wearing these full hazmat suits because the body is still, so to speak, is still oozing infection. And there was a time that there were Jewish dead and they're piling up and no one's burying them. So the Chazon Ish himself takes the bodies, puts them on his shoulder, goes to bury them. And this deed was so stunning to people that kind of it woke them up to action. Someone said to him, well, aren't you scared of getting infected? He says to them, of course I'm scared of getting infected. But I'm even more fearful of leaving these Jewish dead, these Jewish corpses, without the dignity of a proper burial. These are some stories of some of the great leaders and sages of our history, of them stepping up to try to figure out what could they do during a plague, during an outbreak, during an epidemic, or even a pandemic. And I think that's the attitude that we have to ask ourselves, what can I do to contribute towards the needs of the society, of the community, of the people around me? I'm not suggesting that people should have to endanger themselves. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I think the attitude that we have to adopt is an attitude of being proactive in trying to help where we can and trying to contribute what we can towards this universal effort in this trying time. I want to take a short little break. So if people need to go to get something to drink or whatever, I have